Hey, it's Art from My New Microphone. In this video, let's discuss parallel saturation, what it is, why you should use it, and how we can go about using it in our mixes. So what is saturation? Saturation is an effect that effectively combines soft knee program-dependent compression with harmonic distortion or generation. In other words, it has a subtle compression effect while also adding new harmonic content to the signal, often in a very sonically pleasing way. Saturation occurs naturally due to the nonlinearities of analog equipment, notably in components such as tubes, tape, transistors, or transformers, and is also available in audio plugins as a specific effect. Moving on to the other half of the equation, let's discuss parallel processing. Parallel processing is effectively when we have two versions of a signal or a group of signals where one version is affected or processed differently than the other, and then the two are summed together eventually. Some plugins and effects have a dry-wet control to alter the amount of parallel processing going on, with the dry signal being the original signal and the wet signal being affected by whatever that plugin or effect is there to do. However, parallel processing is typically set up with an effects send and return situation where we will send audio from one or more tracks to an effects return or auxiliary track, and then process that auxiliary track with the parallel processing and then mix the two together ultimately at the mix bus. With parallel saturation, we get the benefit of maintaining the original dry signal with all of its clarity and transient information, and we get to mix up an appropriate level of saturation underneath that original track with the parallel aux return. We can even go a bit overboard when it comes to saturating the return channel, knowing that we will have full control over its level so we can mix it underneath the original track within the mix. So what are the benefits of parallel saturation over simply just inserting a saturation plugin on a given track, let's say? The first big benefit is that we have independent control over the saturated version of the signal and the dry version of the signal. In the auxiliary track or return channel, we can really dial in the color of saturation that we want and then mix it appropriately in the mix. We can even insert other processes such as EQ and compression on this auxiliary track to really color that saturation even more. Meanwhile, we are not losing any of the transients or clarity of the original dry signal in the mix. So we can have that strength and clarity of the original track dry and mix the saturation into our heart's content underneath. So with that, let's hop into Logic Pro to have a quick look at parallel saturation and how you can use it in your mixes. All right, here we are inside of Logic Pro to discuss parallel saturation. And what I want to show you here is we will go through live setting up the parallel saturation on the verse vocal right here. And then I also want to show you parallel saturation on the drum bus afterward. So we are working in this session right here. It's on a song called The Unending Maze by one of my projects called Blunt Cousin. And let's just go ahead and quickly listen through the verse by itself. And then we will go ahead and apply parallel saturation to the vocal. So here we go. This is the vocal track right here.
Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor. Been afraid, been courageous, read that page.
And if we were to listen to that in solo.
Been around that corner, crossed that border before. Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor. Been afraid, been courageous, read that page.
So we have a much drier signal to reference against. And the first way to go about parallel saturation is to actually insert a saturation plugin with a wet dry control. So I will be using the Saturn II here. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I love FabFilter's stuff. I'll leave a link in the description box down below for the Saturn II if you'd like to check it out for yourself. And what this plugin allows us to do is control the mix or the wet dry mix of the plugin itself. So if we're all the way down here at 0, it means that we are only getting the dry signal being passed through the plugin. So it's as if the plugin is not applying any saturation. If we go up to 100%, then it means that all of the signal is being passed through this saturation plugin. And then if we go to a mix of 50, for example, it means that we will have equal parts saturated and unsaturated passing through. So if we were to break this down into parallel processing, we would have equal parts dry and wet, or equal parts of the original track and whatever the effects return would be. So to really hear this in action, let's actually crank up the drive of the saturation to make it really obvious. And I will play this back and go between 0 and 100 so that you can hear the amount of saturation that is being implemented on the track. So starting with 0.
Been around the
This is
corner,
completely
across
dry
that
with no
border
parallel processing.
before. Gazed above the wall,
That's completely
across
wet,
the hall, beneath
with
the
no
floor.
parallel processing.
Been afraid, been courageous, read that page.
And now we're dealing with parallel
I spent
processing
my
by
days
altering
with
the
you,
wet dry
been
mix.
around that corner, crossed that border before.
Now, if we were to A/B this by turning it on and off, you can hear when this was maxed out at 100%, it sounded really distorted. However, by drawing it back to 18, and I'll probably go a little bit lower here, we can actually get rather aggressive saturation and then mix it in subtly underneath the dry track and get the effect that we discussed before, where we have the clarity and the transience of the original signal with the coloration of the saturation being mixed in underneath. So let's have a listen here.
Been around that corner, crossed that border before. Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor. Been afraid, been courageous, read that page. I spent my days with you.
So you can hear that there's a little bit of extra color and grit to the vocal without really taking away from the clarity. Of course, we could also process this channel a little bit more lightly with the saturation and then just go a complete 100% on the mix. This is what this would sound like.
Been around that corner, crossed that border before. Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor.
But you can hear there that as we're getting the coloration and that grit of the saturation, it's affecting the entirety of the signal, and so we're losing a little bit of that clarity. Whereas when we mixed it underneath with parallel processing, it sounded a little bit more clear while also being a bit more gritty. But if we want even more control over the parallel processing, or if our plugin doesn't happen to have a wet dry control, we should go about parallel processing in an effects send and return situation. So to do that, let's close out of this. And what I will do here is send this track to a new auxiliary track. Let's call it bus 28, for example. And now what I'll do is I'll scroll over, find 28, call this para saturation. And what I'll do is create a track so that we have it over here right next to the vocal so we can work both of them side by side. And so what we can do here is we can increase the amount that this channel is being sent to the parallel saturation. I'll just go up to unity for now. And then if I play this back, we will have parallel processing where the vocal will be present in this auxiliary track as well.
Been around that corner, crossed
You can see
that
there that
border
it's the exact same.
before. Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor. Been afraid.
And now what we will do is we will bring this saturation plugin over here. Let's bring it all the way to the top. And we will make sure that the wet mix is 100% here. This is important. If your plugin does have a wet dry mix, that acts as the internal sort of parallel processing of the plugin. However, when we're setting up real parallel processing with an effects return and auxiliary track here, then we want this to be entirely wet. We don't want any of the dry signal also being present in the auxiliary track or effects return. So with this, we can go about doing things the same way. Let's crank up this drive and have a listen back, and then we will mix this in underneath the vocal.
Been around that corner, crossed that border before.
So that's a little bit intense. We want to bring
Gazed
it
above
down.
the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor. Been afraid, been courageous, read that page. I spent my days with you. Been around that corner, crossed that border before.
So again, it adds a little bit of grit to the sound without taking away from the clarity and power of the original track right here. And the other big benefit of having a dedicated auxiliary track or effects return for our parallel processing is that we can then go about and add other processes after or before the saturation here. So for example, if I wanted to bandpass this saturation effect, I could go ahead and do that here. Now if we listen back,
been around that corner, crossed that border before. Gazed above the wall, across the hall, beneath the floor.
we can
Been
get
afraid, been courageous, read that page.
a whole bunch of cool effects to go along with the parallel saturation right here. So that's quickly how I would go about and do this on a vocal. Of course, I would be mixing this in the greater context of the mix, and I may even push this a little bit further, make the vocal even that much more gritty. However, in this quick video, I just wanted to show you how I would go setting up parallel saturation on, in this case, a vocal. But before we go, I said that I wanted to show you how to do this also on the drum bus. So right here we have our drum bus. It is bus 1. If we were to scroll all the way over here, we see all of our drum tracks right here. The kicks, snares, we have bass right here, but the 2 kicks, 2 snares, overheads, and 2 toms right here being sent to the drum bus. And we can just do the exact same thing over here. We can send this to a bus. Let's use another one right here, bus 27. We will bring this up to unity, and then we will go over here to the drum saturation bus and insert, again, a saturation plugin. Again, I like the FabFilter Saturn 2, but you can use whatever you'd like. And now if we listen to the drum bus, here's just the drum bus. Here is with some saturation. So it makes it a little bit more weighty. Of course, we are also increasing the loudness, and so we may have the loudness bias to make us think that that's better just because it's loud, but the saturation helps bring in a little bit more grit and character to the overall drums, and we can mix this again as we see fit within the greater context of the mix. All right, so that's parallel saturation in a nutshell for you. Let's now hop out of Logic Pro. All right, so there is parallel saturation. If you found this video informative, I would invite you to hit that like button and to also check out the free My New Microphone mixing cheat sheet in the description box down below. I'll leave a link there for you. Of course, there's no such thing as cheat codes when it comes to mixing, as every mix is different and demands different mix processing. However, this cheat sheet or reference guide I put together for you can help you make the right decisions at the right times when it comes to mixing your music. So again, there's a link to that in the description box below if you're interested. If you want to hang out here on YouTube with me a little bit more, I would also invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, to also check out a few of these other videos I have up here, one on parallel processing and one on parallel compression right here. So check those out, and I'll see you in the next one.